When we're kids, we are inevitably asked the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? But I would suggest that that's a question that's valid to ask yourself even when you are chronologically grown. What do you want to be when you grow up? But sometimes it's really difficult to contemplate that question because you're too busy thinking about the question, what do I need to produce tomorrow? So that's what we're going to be talking about in today's episode, all about how to be a long-term thinker in a short-term world. And we have an expert on this topic who will be joining us, Dorie Clark. Dorie Clark has so many accomplishments to her name. There are too many to list, but let me give you a couple of them. She's a Wall Street Journal bestselling author. She's written more than 200 articles for the Harvard Business Review and even more than that for Forbes. And she's been named 3 times to the Thinkers 50 list of the top business thinkers in the world. Today, we're going to be talking about one of her most recent books, which is The Long Game, and she's going to share some real pearls of wisdom with us. I would suggest that you take a listen, bookmark it on your podcast page because it's a good one, folks. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Karin Reed. I'm a 4-time author, Emmy Award-winning broadcast journalist, and communication expert on helping people to own the room, whether it be a physical one or a virtual one. Welcome to Speaker Dynamics. Dorie, this is such an honor to have you today on the pod. I mean, seriously, you're one of the people who comes into my inbox and I always get so much out of it that I created actually a folder in my mail that I put. Totally
I get my own folder. That's amazing. Thank you.
A Dorie Clark folder in my email, just because I get so much out of everything you send to me, and I'm like, I need to keep this so I can refer back to it. And one of the things that I wanted to focus on today is your latest book, which is The Long Game. Which ironically I'm matching.
Good. Let's match.
With
yeah.
Oh, fantastic. And it spoke to me when it first came out. It continues to speak to me because it's so hard to do sometimes because, it's all about being a long-term thinker in an often short-term world. So what prompted you to write the book in the first place?
So I started ideating around the book in 2018, 2019. And what was really striking me at the time was the conversations that I was having with so many people, because you would, be talking with these, at least outwardly, very successful people. And I kept asking, so how's it going? What's going on with you? And inevitably I would get some variation of, oh, it's great. It's great. I just wish I had time to think. Or, oh, I just wish I had a moment to breathe. And they just sounded so sad and so desperate. And of course, the ironic thing is that most of them were self-employed. And I thought, what's going on here?
I feel that very deeply. Yes.
Yes. It doesn't have to be that way. And yet over and over and over again, it was. And so I realized that we were really having some structural problems, that people were running themselves ragged. They didn't really feel like they had the opportunity, or at least they weren't making the opportunity to take a bigger, more strategic vision. And of course, I'm a big believer in strategy and long-term thinking. And studies show that most of us are, there's almost universal agreement that yes, it's a good thing to have a long-term perspective. And yet no one was doing it. And I wanted to try to investigate that and understand what's getting in the way and how do we fix that?
Yeah, I love that. And somebody who, worked under the corporate mantle for many, many years and then switched to, building my own business. I know I work more than I ever worked, but, I'd like to think from your, guidance, I've been better about just trying to think, okay, what am I trying to achieve, down the road? But that's so hard because you pointed the fact that we have so much busyness in our lives. And, especially I feel like so many of our leaders, and that's primarily our audiences, people who are also feeling this very deeply as leaders, that, they're judged by the short-term metrics. Do you have advice for those who want to be long-term thinkers, but feel like the push to be short-term, deliver on results, tomorrow is just so strong?
Yeah. There's always that push and pull that we have to navigate. Certainly you do have a little bit more autonomy if you're self-employed, because, you get to call the shots. You get to decide when you're taking your payoff and when you're sort of reinvesting and tilling the land. But even if you're in a situation where you have a boss, you're working for somebody else, they're demanding results, I think there's a couple of things that we can be mindful of. One is, even if the majority of your attention is sort of forced to be short term, you can always be the person who's at least, sort of raising your hand and reminding people about the long run. It doesn't necessarily mean anybody's going to listen or do anything about it, but it is a useful frame to be able to step back and say, great, yes, I will do all the things here, but I just want to have a step back for a minute, because if we actually were to do X, Y, and Z, we might be able to get even better returns a year from now. And just sort of continually raising the question and trying to show by example that it is a thing worth considering, worth talking about, and being part of that conversation. I think another piece of it as well is, if you're in a position where you have at least a little bit of discretion, like you have to show short-term results, but maybe you're in enough of a leadership position that you can kind of choose what they are, or how are you going to demonstrate the results. The example that I always think about, I come from a background in politics, and one of the things that always stayed with me was in the 1996 re-election campaign, Bill Clinton had this whole plank about school uniforms. Now, this is honestly the dumbest thing in the entire world. Like, why is a president talking about school uniforms? It's freaking ridiculous.
Yep.
But on the other hand, remarkably effective, because what he needed to accomplish was he needed something that would be an incredibly low-cost, symbolic intervention that showed that he cared about crime and was tough on crime, which Democrats historically had not been perceived as being. And so by way of doing that and saying, hey, school uniforms, that's going to keep kids from killing each other over their Air Jordans. I mean, on the face of it, it's just stupid, but right. It's very effective. And so similarly, I think that we need to sort of think about, like, well, what's our school uniforms, right? We can pick, if we're looking for a very visible short-term success, what is the low-hanging fruit? What is the thing that we can do fast? What is the thing that we can do without much money? And if we can pick that so that we can spend more of the time and energy that really counts on the longer-term goals, we can hold the critics at bay long enough with our school uniforms to actually be advancing toward meaningful things. Like, in Bill Clinton's case, he actually balanced the budget, which, if I'm not mistaken, hasn't been balanced since. So, if we can think about things like that, that would help.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I loved in your book is you talked about optimizing for interesting. Like, if you're trying to figure out, okay, you somehow created white space, what do you fill that white space with? You suggest optimizing for interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, I come out of a background in the humanities. I was a philosophy major. I went to, graduate school for theology. And so I'm always interested in questions about how people make meaning in their lives. And it seems like in our modern society, there's really kind of two pat answers that in the discourse are often viewed as diametrically opposed, which is you either optimize for money and you take the investment banking job out of school or whatever, or you optimize for meaning. And then you're working for, some charity and feeding people in Africa, and you're practically starving yourself because you're not making any money. And so, those are sort of the two, in the public discourse, the two views. You optimize for money or for meaning. And I actually think that there's a useful third way that we can be thinking about, which, to your point, is optimizing for interesting. Because frankly, in addition to the fact that we get so locked in sometimes, if you're optimizing for money, of course, a lot of times we know culturally, people can be quite unhappy. Money gets you to a certain place, but it doesn't get you to the finish line. It is, you could say, necessary, but not sufficient. But if you're optimizing for interesting, you're choosing things that are genuinely meaningful and cool to you. It doesn't have to be meaningful to society in the sense of like you're saving a life every day, but I mean, it could be.
Right.
But it's something that is interesting enough to you that it almost feels like its own reward. It is something that because you find it pleasurable, you probably are going to invest more time and energy at becoming good at it, attaining mastery, which makes it more likely that you probably will earn money doing it, depending what it is. And it's something that also kind of takes the pressure down a few notches, because there's also a lot of pressure in our society to, to identify like, here's what I'm meant to do. Here's my calling. And I feel like, oh, it's so stressful. A lot of people get paralyzed with that and they just like give up entirely because they say, well, I don't know what my purpose is. I don't know what my passion is. But if you can find things that are interesting, at least it's a lower bar, but it means you're going to be having a good time. And it tends to be a series of breadcrumbs that can lead you toward the discovery of your passion, your purpose, and ultimately economic success.
Yeah, I love that. And I would also want to follow up with the question, what do you do to optimize for interesting? Like, did you have something that you thought, hey, this is kind of out of my typical thing, but I want to pursue it? Like, is there something that fills that white space that might be unexpected?
So yeah, one of the things, there's plenty of things that I try to do that are interesting. I mean, my latest one in the last few weeks is that I've really tried to get good at learning to cook Indian food. This has been something that I, have enjoyed eating for a long time, but I've never really, attempted to achieve mastery at it. But I've been cooking like multiple times, like Indian dinners the last few weeks. So that's very satisfying. But a big project, like a longer term project, which I chronicle in the long game, is learning to write musical theater. I have been at this now for 8 years. And, one of my premises in the long game, of course, is, just really trying to sort of manifest the principle that a lot of people have heard, which is that we overestimate what we can do in a day and we underestimate what we can do in a year. That is magnified even more when we put the deadline at 10 years. And so I went from really just not ever having done it, not knowing anything about how to write musical theater, to now 8 years in. I mean, if you actually spend 8 years doing something, you can get pretty good. That's kind of remarkable, but you actually can. Yeah. So I'm plugging away at that.
I love that so much. And, it speaks to my performance side. I actually did do theater. I know that like you were not a theater kid, right? When you were growing up, or
no, I grew up in this little small town that didn't even have enough people for such things. We didn't have theater. There was no theater. Was not an option.
Yeah, but perhaps you're influenced by living in New York and you're just like, this is a community that I enjoy. So, I think it's great that you're doing that. And it's a way of, using your brain in a different way. And I think it's important for all of us to do that. I know you talk about Google's, 20%, using 20% of your time to do something completely different. Or I may not have the right phrasing on that, but, is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. The mandate for Googlers is that you could, in theory at least, right. and I feel like the crucial thing here, which is so interesting to me, it's actually that most people who work at Google don't do this. They do not take advantage of it because, like everybody else, they're too busy. So I think that that's very telling as well. But in theory, when you work for Google, you are encouraged to take 20% time, which is to allocate about a fifth of your time to, it's not sort of randomly different projects, but it's things that meet a couple of criteria. It's something that you are personally interested in and that you feel will be beneficial to the company. So it's like experiment, but you're not just kind of like crocheting or whatever. It's like you're doing something.
Indian food.
Yeah, exactly.
I made a curry last night though, Dorie, that I was thinking about, well, maybe I should like trade recipes with her, but I don't have a tandoor oven, to be able to do that. But,
I haven't yet bought a tandoori oven yet either. So I'm still in the beginning stages, but yeah, so like Gmail was invented as part of 20% time. So it's very much intended to be like long-term experiments that may or may not work, but could be quite good if they did.
Right. And yeah, just such a valuable, bet, I guess, to, put the 20% into that. So I'm going to put on the communication coach hat. You can wear it as well. I know very, very well. If we are trying to be long-term thinkers, how do we project that to those external to us, whether that be our team, our clients, or our customers? What do you say are some of the techniques that you can employ?
Yeah, so this is a really important point, of course, because in everything that we do, we need to not just do it, we need to make sure that we're telegraphing properly to others that we're doing it so that hopefully we can get buy-in, hopefully we can, sort of grow a brand as a strategic thinker, et cetera. So I think part of it is, and of course, we always have to be mindful not to do something so often that it reaches the point of parody where people are like, oh, it's a drinking game. Like, how many times is she going to say long term, but,
yep. Productivity. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Gotcha.
Exactly. But I think that ultimately, it's useful, like looking for natural places to interject things. You can talk about articles or books that you've read that have taught you a new interesting concept about thinking long term or thinking more strategically. I mean, we've got some good suggestions right here.
Right.
You can also, as we were saying earlier, in meetings or things like that, just kind of raise the question like, well, what would be the long term implications of this? Or, if everybody's like, well, what about the next 3 months, okay, great. That becomes the place where you can say, okay, yes, we need to figure this out for the next 3 months. If we take the conversation that we've just had about how we're spending time for the next 3 months, what are the implications of that for next year and for 5 years from now? And is that getting us in the direction that we want, or is it getting us a little bit off course from that? And how do we think that through? So it's really just kind of being the conscience of the organization, I think, in many ways, because again, there's almost universal agreement. I mean, one of the interesting studies that I cite in the long game is there was a study done a number of years ago by the Management Research Group, and they surveyed 10,000 senior leaders. And they said, what is the most important thing you could be doing for the future of your organization? And 97% said strategic long-term thinking. Like everybody, I mean, it's literally almost everybody thinks it's important. So it's not that they don't want to do it. It's calling people to their better selves. It's reminding them that it is a thing that they want to do.
Yeah. So say that you have like a long-term goal, and you think, okay, this is what I want to work towards. One of the things that I've heard you talk about is if somebody says, so, what have you been up to lately? It's important to have an answer to that question teed up. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I have spent a long time talking about is questions around personal brand and reputation. I talked about that a lot in my first book, Reinventing You. Yep. And a thing that people worry about a lot is, but I don't want to sound like I'm bragging. I don't want to talk about myself because then it'll be too self-promotional or something like that. And, I get it. It's true that if for some reason we went too far and were perceived as bragging, then of course it backfires. People don't like it. But an interesting question for me is I think that there's a pretty wide range of behavior in between you never talking about yourself and you being viewed as offensively braggy. And so what is in that range? And one thing that seemed really easy for me, even for people who are a little uncomfortable with the social cues around it, is when someone asks you a question, they are expecting an answer. You need to answer it in some fashion. So it is not crazy for you to offer information in response to a question. So one of the lowest hanging fruits is when someone is sort of saying like, hey, what's up? Tell me what's new. What's the latest? If you can use that moment to actually convey legitimate information that you want people to have as compared to just, making up some random thing off the top of your head, right. That seems like a good use of your time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because you will select the things that will perhaps feed into the narrative that you want out there, as opposed to, what you had for breakfast that morning. And it's valuable to have that, on quick recall if you can. And that's something that I'm glad that you talked about, is just, the push and pull of like wanting to have people know that you can be of service, but also not wanting to be braggy. I mean, I remember when I started doing this, I'm like, do people really want to hear from me? Like, is it like, should I do a podcast? Like, do it felt very uncomfortable to me. I hated the idea of coming into their inbox because I know what my email inbox looks like. Aside from Dorie Clark, I try to like get down to everything else. Like, inbox, I don't get to inbox 0, but maybe inbox 100, under 100. But I was surprised when people would write back and they're like, "Hey, we're so excited that you're doing this." I'm like, "Really? Really?" Like, everybody has a podcast. Like, so that was a good lesson for me, I guess. And so I imagine that you spend a lot of time helping people like jump over, that hurdle that we put, in front of ourselves, because I guess, and I see this with my leaders, like a lot of them are brilliant, but they keep all that brilliance under a bushel. And then the question is like, what is that benefiting? So what do you suggest to those who are, saying, "I don't want to talk about what I can do"? Like, what do you tell them?
Yeah. So I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, a lot of people, whether it's because of, how they're raised or, whatever it is, they don't feel comfortable with it. And so what ends up happening is that I think a lot of people, if you're not comfortable with something, you kind of create a straw man in your mind. And you look at that straw man, you're like, well, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be like her, or, whatever, whoever the mythical offensive her is. And so they just take that as the excuse to not do anything. And of course, that's a nice little psychology trick that people can pull, but it's not very helpful or effective in terms of their career advancement. It would be a lot more useful to say, well, what is a way that I could do this that actually works for me and feels comfortable to me? So basically, all this is to say that I think people often sort of like overcompensate because they feel like, okay, I don't want to do it. And then finally they do it, and then they sometimes almost deliberately overdo it just to prove that, like, no, that was terrible. I'm never going to do it again. It's like, oh, come on, guys, come on. Like,
there's a middle ground. Yes.
Every time somebody talks about themselves, it's not a form of bragging. And so I think that, my sort of favorite frame about this is just stay away from adjectives. Like, I think where people get upset is that, they're like, well, I don't want to have to be saying like, I'm the best at this, or I'm the greatest, and blah, blah, blah. It's like, great. Don't say any of that. Let other people be the judge of it. But you do need to convey facts. You do need to convey nouns and verbs so that people will have data so that they can actually form their own adjectival conclusions.
I love that. That's such an interesting equation that I hadn't considered before. So thank you so much for sharing that. A lot of this conversation, I'm sure, is had in your recognized expert course and program. So for our listeners, can you just explain a little bit about what that involves and really who it would be for?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the past 8 years, I've actually run an online course and community called Recognized Expert. And it's really intended for people, whether they work inside of an organization or they're self-employed, who are professionals, often very accomplished professionals. Most people are mid-career or senior, and they know that they want to make a bigger contribution. They know that they have ideas that they want to share or opportunities that they would like to be able to, have access to, but they have not necessarily spent as much time figuring out how to achieve scale with that, sort of grow the platform, as it were, as compared to getting good at the thing that they do. And so Recognized Expert is a course that is specifically about helping talented people figure out how, in a way that feels comfortable for them, they can best, sort of be on a bigger stage and reach more people with their ideas or get access to more opportunities so that they can have a bigger impact. So we have more than 800 people who have been through the program, and it's a really active community, which is a lot of fun to be able to run and help people make connections with each other.
Yeah, and I imagine there's a lot of long game discussion in that where, what do you want to be when you grow up, basically? People, chronologically might already be there, but I think it's helpful to know, what is the goal? How do I get there? But, perhaps you can guide them along, be the Sherpa to their, successful achievement of that goal. If we can bring it back to the long game, one of the things that I was wondering about is, okay, so say you have the long game in mind, you know what you want to be, but then you're like, wait, maybe I don't want to be that. Is it okay to shift your goal over time?
Yeah, it's always okay to shift your goal over time. I think that, a concept that I actually talked about a lot in my first book, Reinventing You, is that a lot of times people get upset and frustrated because they feel like the time that they spent on a thing is wasted time. And then they feel bad about themselves, or they feel bad about their choices. But, the truth is, I think it's important to remind people, it's not that whenever you were pursuing whatever goal it was or career it was, you weren't just sitting eating bonbons. Like, you actually did things. You met people, you made connections, you learned skills, and many of those skills and many of those connections are probably transferable. And it means also that you see the world in a slightly different way, which sometimes can be extremely helpful. I mean, in another book that I did, Stand Out, I profile a guy named Eric Schott, who went on to become a sort of leading biologist and a big figure in the world of sort of big data and how big data and biology intersect. And his background, the part that was really interesting was that he hadn't started as a biologist. He had actually been a mathematician and a computer scientist. And, so on one hand, at first glance, you might be like, well, he's working in biology now. What a waste of time that he did all this stuff. But it was not, in fact, a waste of time, because it meant when he shifted to biology, he was one of the earliest people who actually understood the math of big data and could figure out how to analyze things in a new way that science wasn't used to doing. So it helped him make breakthroughs and write papers that other people, especially in those earliest days, couldn't figure out how to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I kind of experienced that myself whenever I was doing a webinar on the future of meetings, first week of March 2020 with Dr. Joe Allen, who is one of the foremost meeting scientists. And, I was there as a video communication expert, and we said, oh yeah, in 5 to 10 years, there will be many more meetings where video is at their core. And then it all happened like 2 weeks later. So you're like, oh, this actually is a thing. Yeah. So I definitely, see the idea of things panning out in ways that you hadn't imagined in an exciting new way that allows you to flex your brain differently. So one of the things that I do, Dorie, at the end of all of these podcasts is ask my guests to deliver one big takeaway. So are you ready? Are you ready to deliver your one big takeaway, something that they can think about until the next episode? What would you suggest?
It is high pressure. It is high pressure, Karin, but I'm ready.
Okay. What's your one big takeaway, Dorie, from our conversation? What would you say?
Okay, amazing. So one thing that I want to encourage people to think about, and this is a concept that I share in the long game, is that, ultimately, if we're all sort of suffering under the yoke of being pulled in too many directions, having too many things to do, we have to recognize that inevitably there are going to be times and there are going to be moments when that is necessary. I mean, to your point earlier about short-term results, sometimes you got to just make it happen. But it's also true that if we want to be smart about long-term thinking, we can't always be doing that. And so that's why one of the frames that I shared, which I first discovered through a colleague of mine named Jared Kleinert, and found really helpful, is heads up and heads down mode. And it's basically, understanding that we need to be periodically toggling between heads up, which is where, we're kind of looking around. It's kind of a more social mode. You're getting new inputs, new ideas, new connections. And it enables you with your head up to look around and say, well, where are the opportunities? Have the circumstances changed? Do I need to shift my direction? What should my strategy be? And then you shift down into heads down mode so that you can execute on it. But the problem is that for many of us, we've gotten stuck permanently in heads down mode. and you forget to come back up and you forget to actually say, wait, is my strategy still relevant here? And every once in a while, you do need to ask that question. So being mindful of that shift is really important. I'll also mention for anyone who's interested in it, I have a free resource, which is the Long Game Strategic Thinking Self-Assessment. You can get it at dorieclark.com/thelonggame. And you can dive into these questions about optimizing for interesting and about heads up and heads down and more.
I have taken it. I've enjoyed it. It has been incredibly helpful. And you've been very helpful for sharing your wisdom with all of our listeners today. Dorie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Karin. So great to be here.
So I tried not to fangirl too much during that conversation with Dorie, but truly she has had such an impact on me as a professional that it was just a delight to have her with us here today so that she could pass along some of that to you. And guess what? There's more that we can share because if you want to hear more of the conversation that wasn't able to fit into that half-hour block, it is available to you. If you go to speakerdynamics.com/bonus content, speakerdynamics.com/bonus content, you can hear a little mini episode where I just talked to Dorie a little bit more about the importance of being generous with others who are perhaps following in your footsteps and how that has guided her throughout her successful professional journey. It is a valuable piece of wisdom that I would love to be able to put out into the world to all of you. So do take a listen if you can. But for now, I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode. Until next time.